There's very solid evidence, namely that you have different sources telling the same stories, and in almost every instance when different sources tell the same stories, in the New Testament, the stories are different. Sometimes in little ways, sometimes in big ways. Somebody was changing the stories. You can see this for yourself. The reason people don't see this normally is because the way people normally read the Bible. The way you normally read the Bible is you're going to read the Gospels, and so you start reading the Gospel of Matthew. And you start Matthew chapter 1, verse 1. The first 16 verses are genealogies, not very interesting. You read them anyway because it's the Bible. And then you go on through, you get down then to chapter 17, and the action starts picking up. And you read Matthew. You go through chapter 1, then chapter 2, chapter 3. You go all the way through chapter 28. You've read Matthew. Then you start reading Mark. You start at the beginning of Mark. You go to the bottom, chapters 1 through 16. Then you read Luke. And Mark, by the way, sounds a lot like Matthew. Then you read Luke, and it sounds a lot like Mark. You read John, it's kind of different, but it sounds pretty much like the others. They're all basically saying the same story. The reason it sounds that way is because you're reading them vertically. The way to notice differences in the Gospels is to read them not vertically, but to read them horizontally. Read a story in Matthew, then read the same story in Mark, and then read the same story in Luke, and compare them in detail. In almost every instance, you will find differences. Let me just give you some examples from the death accounts and resurrection accounts of Jesus. The accounts of Jesus' death. What day did Jesus die on, and what time of day? Did Jesus die on the day before the Passover meal was eaten, as John explicitly says, John 19, verse 14, or was he executed on the day after the Passover meal was eaten, as Mark explicitly says? Which was it? Before or after the meal? Did he die sometime after noon, as John explicitly says? Or did he die at 9, was he crucified at 9 o'clock in the morning, as Mark explicitly says? It depends which account you read. Did Jesus carry his cross the entire way himself, or did Simon of Cyrene carry his cross? It depends which gospel you read. Did both of the robbers crucified with Jesus mock him, or did only one of them mock him and the other come to his defense? It depends which gospel you read. Did the curtain in the temple rip in half before Jesus died, or did it rip in half after he died? It depends which gospel you read. Those are simply examples from Jesus' death. You can do this with any story found commonly throughout the Gospels. In more than one Gospel, you will find that, in fact, you have different stories. Now look at the resurrection. Can we trust these sources to give us a reliable account of what happened at the resurrection? Well, look at the stories themselves in the Gospels and ask yourself, are they telling the same story or not? Who went to the tomb on the third day? Was it Mary Magdalene alone, or Mary with other women? If it was with other women, how many other women were there? Which ones were they, and what were their names? It depends which gospel you read. Was the stone rolled away before they got there or not? It depends which gospel you read. What did they see when they got to the tomb? Did they see one man? Did they see two men? Or did they see one angel? It depends which gospel you read. Now, by the way, people try and reconcile all these differences. I mean, for example, with this one here, what the people will say is, well, what they actually saw were two angels. So that one gospel says it was two men because they mistook the angels for men. Another says it was one angel because there was one angel, but there was also another one. And there was also one man because there was an angel who was mistaken for man, but there was also another one. So the way you solve the problem is you say there were two angels. In other words, you solve the problem by saying something that none of the Gospels say. That's how you reconcile it, by creating your own gospel. What were the women at the tomb told to tell the disciples? Were the disciples supposed to stay in Jerusalem, or were they supposed to go to Galilee to see Jesus? It depends which gospel author you read. Did the women tell anyone what they saw or not? It depends which gospel you read. All of these differ depending on which gospel you read. Did the disciples leave Jerusalem to go to Galilee, or did they stay in Jerusalem? Did they never leave, or did they leave right away? It depends which gospel you read. These gospels are all different from one another in their details. Are they the kind of sources that historians would rely upon for historical information? I would argue that, in fact, these are not the kinds of sources that can be relied upon by historians. Now, let me emphasize something, because I do want to get out of here alive. I am not, this might sound weird to you, I actually am not disputing the theological value of the Gospels. I'm asking about their historical merit. There's a difference between having a book that is theologically useful and a book that is historically accurate. Theology and history are not the same thing. And what I'm going to be maintaining in this debate is that claims about Jesus' resurrection are theological claims, they are not historical claims. And the Gospels are theological documents, they're not historically accurate documents. My conclusions about the Gospel narratives: these are not reliable historical accounts. The accounts that we have are based on oral traditions that have been in circulation for decades. Year after year, Christians trying to convert other people. They had an intention when they told these stories. They told these stories in order to convince other people that Jesus was raised from the dead. The authors who wrote down these stories decades later were not eyewitnesses. They were Greek-speaking Christians living 35 to 65 years after the events that they narrate. These authors are telling stories that Christians had been telling during those years. There was no one there at the time of Jesus' death taking notes. The stories, many of them were actually invented. Most of the stories were in fact changed. For these reasons, the gospel accounts are not as useful as we would like them to be for historical sources. They're not contemporary, they're not disinterested, they're not consistent with one another. Now, as emphatic as I've tried to be about that, the reality is what I've just told you the last 15 minutes is not the big problem. The big problem with arguing that the resurrection can be proved by historians is something else. It's a major obstacle that no historian can overcome no matter what. This is the obstacle. Historians, by their very nature, try to establish what probably happened in the past. You can't repeat the experiment of the past. That's why you have people who can deny that certain things that almost certainly happen. The University of Tennessee, ranked #1 in college basketball, lost the game 3 nights ago. We in Chapel Hill are glad to know. It's almost certain, but you can't repeat it. How do you know? Well, you have newspaper accounts, but you can't repeat the experiment. Did the Holocaust happen? Yes. But people deny it. Why? Because you can't repeat the experiment. Historians can only establish what probably happened in the past. And what are miracles exactly? Well, Mike has already told us what miracles are. Miracles, in any given instance, are the least probable occurrence. They violate what we think of as the natural working of the natural order. If they weren't spectacularly unusual, they wouldn't be miracles. By definition, miracles are the least probable occurrence. No human being in this room can walk on water. What are the chances that anyone can walk on water? Well, the chances are less than 1 in 5 billion because there's nobody on the planet who can walk on water unless the water happens to be frozen. Can you demonstrate that somebody ever probably walked on water? Not if it's the least probable occurrence for something having happened. The probabilities are infinitesimally remote. So too with the resurrection of Jesus. I am not saying, and I want to be emphatic about this point, I am not saying that Jesus was not raised from the dead. That's not my argument. My argument is that if Jesus was raised from the dead, historians cannot prove it because of the nature of historical evidence. A theologian may say that it's true, and then you'd have to argue about it on theological grounds, but the historian cannot show it. The historian's dilemma is this: how can the least probable occurrence, a miracle, ever be the most probable? By definition, it's the least probable occurrence. Historians can never establish the least probable occurrence as being the most probable, which means historians can never establish that the resurrection ever happened. It cannot be proved by historians. Maybe it happened, maybe it didn't happen,